Chapter 8. I found freedom rather boring once I'd settled into my new routine. I found an apartment on Cumberland Ave, which was within walking distance of where I worked, and then I furnished it with used furniture. Working was easy, that is, after the first couple of weeks when I got over my nervousness. I worked for Mr. Lord, a young lawyer who did real estate work. I was nervous about making mistakes when I typed up all the legal forms. I was nervous answering the phone. I was nervous each time I handed in a letter I had typed for his signature, in case I hadn't got my shorthand right. Mr. Lord was generous with his compliments, though, and that soon put me at ease. The other girls in the office were pleasant. Several were my age, and when I got to know them better, we would go to the movies or shopping together. Evenings and weekends I spent on the search for my parents. I'd take the list and a map of the city and go to the addresses on the list. Sometimes the addresses would lead to a parking lot or to a new building. The house where we lived on Jarvis had been torn down and replaced by a government building. I would feel a vague kind of relief when this happened because I didn't like the people I'd meet who once knew Henry and Alice Raintree a long time ago. I found out that both of them had relatives in the north. I wasn't going to go to the northern towns on the slim chance that I might find them because I considered it unlikely. At one address on Charles Street, I was practically dragged into the house by a rather large, squat woman. When I asked if she knew the whereabouts of Henry or Alice Raintree and told her who I was, a grin spread on her face from ear to ear. All happy and smiling, she took me by the arm and led me into the house. She hadn't seen my parents for the last couple of years, but maybe Jacques did. I figured Jacques had to be her husband. I didn't want to stay there, but I could think of no polite way of leaving. Besides, she assured me that Jacques would be home in a short while. Meanwhile, she offered me some tea, then a beer, but I refused both. She'd been cooking and she resumed her position at the old stove. I sat at the kitchen table looking around. What a horrible place. The linoleum was coming up at the seams, and here and there pieces were missing. I could see why it hadn't been washed. The cupboards had been also painted white, maybe 20 years ago. The plaster was also coming off the walls, and the ceiling was warped with water stains. Flies. They were everywhere, and they reminded me of the book Lord of the Flies. One fly landed on the rim of an uncovered lard can which sat on the table with some bread. It rubbed its legs together as if with glee. How could anyone eat that food and not be sick? And suddenly it was very important to me that those flies not touch me, and I waved them away. Of course, the windows couldn't be closed, but hadn't they ever heard of screens? I wondered what they did in the wintertime, when the smell of the place must be raunchy. They were probably immune to all the germs in the house, but me, I feared going home, getting sick, and missing work. I stared over at the old woman, her back to me, probably unaware of my presence. From our initial encounter, I thought she would have been the talkative type, but no, she was silently busy filling up a pot of cut up vegetables. I thought she probably used the flies for meat, and then I scolded myself for being so merciless. I couldn't help it, though. I looked down at her feet, stockingless, and stuck into a pair of men's backless slippers. Her legs were lumpy with varicose veins or some other disease. Her heels were dried and scaly. Ugh, ugly. Her, this house, this kind of existence. I finally cleared my throat, mostly to remind her that I was still sitting behind her. I have to really go now. I'm supposed to meet someone. I could come back another time, I said. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sure Jacques would have been here back by now, she said, turning to me. Are you sure you really have to go? You could stay for supper. Well, thank you, but I really have to go. I turned to leave, knowing I would not return. Later, as I sat in the bathtub, washing off all those germs I'd probably picked up, I thought about the scene I had witnessed. If I hadn't been brought up in a foster homes, I would most likely have been brought up in those slums. I would have been brought up with flies, with mice and rats and lice and germs. I would have been brought up by alcoholic parents, and what would I be like now? Would I have any ambitions? Or would I come to live just for today, glad when each day would end? I would not go back to the house on St. Charles. I would not go out of my way for a long time to come and try to find my parents who had abandoned Cheryl and me, all for bottles of booze. When I had finished my bath, I put all the papers Mr. Wendell had given me, along with the new addresses I had been given, into a box and stuck the box in the back of the closet, out of sight and out of mind. If I did find my parents, there would probably be emotional pain for Cheryl and me. It would probably tear me apart once again. That part of my life was now finished for good. I had a plan to follow, and from now on I would stick to it, whether Cheryl agreed with it or not. It was my only way to survive. Mr. Steindl usually came to get me for the long weekends so I could spend them with Cheryl. Otherwise, I usually stayed home, watched TV, read books or magazines, and if I wanted to go out and do something, I would go to the movies. I'd buy magazines that featured beautiful homes and I'd study how they were decorated. And then I would lay back and daydream of myself being in one of those homes, giving lavish parties, and I'd have a lot of friends surrounding me. I also studied fashion magazines, and I'd spend hours shopping for just the right thing. I had no idea how I was going to become rich. All I knew was that one day I would have a beautiful home, a big fancy car, and the most gorgeous clothing ever. Yes, when fortune kissed me with wealth, I'd be well prepared. I had been working at Harbison Law Firm for almost 6 months when another lawyer who was added to the 11 already there. When I first saw Roger Madison, I thought to myself, now there's a man I wouldn't mind spending the rest of my life with. It wasn't that I was a sucker for all handsome men, just that his rugged kind of handsomeness was the kind I could look at forever. Since some of the other girls openly swooned over him, I figured I'd be cool about my infatuation with him. But then I had to do some work for him because he didn't have his own secretary. My infatuation quickly wore off. He was a perfectionist, and when I made my first small mistake, he tore into me. I was so angry that he would criticize me, or maybe it was that I was hurt that our feelings weren't mutual. I practically yelled right back at him. From then on, we were sarcastic towards each other, made snide remarks, always trying to outdo the other. Even when he did get his own secretary and she began to do all of his work, we still glared at each other whenever it was appropriate. Or he would smile and greet everyone, excluding me. The thing I couldn't figure out was that he seemed to study me an awful lot. I'd be working away, and then I'd feel his eyes on me. I'd look up and there he was, but he'd give me a dirty look and turn away. While I worked, Cheryl was finishing her grade 12. In June, she graduated at the top of her class and even won a scholarship to go to the University of Winnipeg. If she hadn't, Children's Aid would have paid for her education anyways. There were some advantages to being a ward of the CAS. In July, Cheryl moved in with me, even though she wouldn't be 18 until October. Children's Aid agreed to pay all of her expenses. The day Cheryl moved in with me, July 6th of 1968, was like a real, honest Independence Day. The Steindls brought Cheryl and her belongings to my place that Saturday morning, had lunch with us, and then left. Cheryl and I went shopping for a sofa that opened into a bed. Then we went to the other stores. We dropped our purchases off at the apartment, then went out for supper. That evening, we sat around talking and thinking about the wonderful feelings of being together, with no one to control our destinies but us. I went to work on Monday, and Cheryl went to the Winnipeg Native Friendship Center. She volunteered her services for the rest of July and August, believing the experience would help her in her future career as a social worker. Cheryl began her first year of university in September. I began to meet her for lunch at the university cafeteria. She quickly accumulated a number of friends, both white and Native. And to my biggest surprise, she started going out quite steadily with a white student, Garth Tyndall. I was amazed because the way she had talked in the past, she didn't like anything white. I wasn't surprised she could attract the opposite sex because she was very beautiful. She was also outgoing in her new crowd and stubborn when she made up her mind about anything. When she was home, she'd usually have her friends around, and when she was over at Garth's place in the evenings, I would be alone. I gave a party for her 18th birthday. I could see that night how close she and Garth had become. He seemed to care about her more than she did about him. I was very pleased. If anyone could change a woman's mind about things, it was a man. But my hopes were dashed when a month later they split up. At first, Cheryl wouldn't tell me what happened. One night, she was supposed to have been going to dinner with him and then a movie. They had gone out together, but later in that evening, Garth had called for her. When she came home a few minutes later, I said to her, "I thought you two were going out tonight." "No, something more important came up. If he calls again, tell him I'm not in. I'm going to take a bath and go to bed." She seemed very depressed. "Hey, Cheryl, did you two have a fight?" "No, not a fight, more of an insight." With that, she stalked off to the bathroom. Garth called again, and I was tempted to ask him what had happened, but I felt I should hear from Cheryl. The next day was Saturday, and Cheryl was still in a state of depression. Finally, I asked her again what had happened. After hesitating, she finally told me. We were walking down Portage, and Garth saw some of his friends coming towards us. He told me to keep walking and he'd catch up. I pretended that I was window shopping so I could listen to them. And you know what he did? You know what that creep did? He left me there and went for a beer with them. He didn't want them to know about me. That goddamn hypocrite. He's ashamed of me. I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything because I was guilty of that too. I had never invited Cheryl to come and meet me for lunch because I didn't want anyone at work to see her, to know she was my sister. Even now, I knew this wouldn't change me. I would continue to walk for 5 blocks or so at lunchtime so I could meet her where was already accepted. That night, Cheryl decided that she was going to keep a journal. I smiled and told her she shouldn't start a journal with an unhappy ending. Wait until something good happens to you, something special. Well, I haven't got a lifetime. I want to start this thing right now. I have a feeling there will be a lot more of this kind of thing. I thought to myself, oh no, I could be in there one day. Not long after Cheryl's breakup with Garth, I met someone I thought was special. I was waiting for Cheryl outside of one of her classrooms when another of Cheryl's professors approached me. We talked until Cheryl came out. His name was Jerry McAllister, and whenever he saw me alone after that, he'd stop to chat. One day, he asked me to go out with him. I guess he thought I shared some of the same ideas as Cheryl, because he talked about Native subjects like their housing and education. Having heard Cheryl speak about such things often enabled me to carry a reasonable conversation with him. When he dropped me off at the apartment, he asked me to go out with him again, but he didn't try to kiss me. I had gone out with some of the students to plays and concerts, but they only had one thing on their minds at the end of the evening. So Jerry's behavior was refreshing to me. We'd go out together frequently after that, even during the week. He was always a perfect gentleman. The more I saw of him, the more I appreciated him. Finally, one night when we stayed at my place for dinner and some conversation, he made his first advance. I held back. Good girls don't do that kind of thing. Furthermore, and more importantly, if things got out of hand and we went all the way, there was a risk of getting pregnant. Maybe this was my worst fear because when Jerry tried to get too close, I would always back off. Jerry's initial amusement and patience waned, and one night he was trying to coax me again. Finally, he said, April, what are you scared of? Are you scared of getting involved with another human being? Or is it sex you're afraid of? I don't know. I never. So how would I know? I can't, that's all. I hadn't wanted to I hadn't wanted to reveal that I was of the Stone Age. It made me feel so immature. Jerry smiled and said, April, if you feel the same way that I feel, then making love is the most natural thing in the world. And if it's respect you're worried about, I'll certainly not respect you any less. We're not teenagers anymore. We're man and woman, adults with feelings and adult needs. He pulled me close to him and I tensed up. I can't. Why not? There's nothing wrong with it. Now stop acting so childish. He took his arms from around me and sat up. No, I'm sorry, Jerry. I want to, but I just can't. I looked at him for some understanding. He stood up and went to the closet and got his coat out. And as he put it on, he said, I don't like playing silly little games, April. Either you want me or you don't. And when you make up your mind which it is, I'll be at the university. In the following weeks, I agonized over Jerry's absence. I had really liked the intimate suppers, long talks, and having a steady friend to go out with. I had planned to ask him to our social and show him off, especially to Roger Madison. I didn't attend the law firm's Christmas social after all. I went with Cheryl to spend the Christmas with the Steindals and returned alone because of work. I was so lonely during the holidays that my resolve broke down and I decided to call him. I had never been to his home, and I looked up his number in the phone book. And as I dialed the number, I thought of being flippant about the whole thing. I'd say something like, Hi, Jerry. I was wrong, and you were right, so I'm yours for the taking. No, that wasn't my style. I'd just play it by ear. Hello? A small child's voice answered. Hello, is Jerry McAllister there, please? No, Daddy's not home. Do you want to talk to my mommy? And before I could say no, I heard the child calling to his mother. Hello, came the voice of a woman, and I tried to picture what she looked like. Oh, hello, Mrs. McAllister. I'm a student from the university and I was working on a project over the holidays, but I needed Mr. McAllister's advice on something. I'm sorry to be bothering him at home. My cheeks were flaming hot. Oh, that's all right. He should be back any minute now. Could I have him call you back? Oh, just a minute. I think he's at the door now. Hold on. I thought of hanging up, but if I did, it might arouse the wife's suspicions. Hello? Jerry's voice came on. It's me, April. I guess I made a terrible mistake. I'm sorry. I hung up before he could say anything. I felt incredibly stupid. I had been going around with a married man. And not only that, he had a child, maybe more than one. And I was about to go to bed with him. I shook my head and I sat there for a long time. He came to see me one evening after New Year's. April, I'd like to explain. There's nothing to explain. You're married. You wanted me to, well, and all the time you were married and you don't like playing games? I said sarcastically. My wife and I have been talking about getting a divorce. Then I met you, and I wanted to get to know you right away. I'm sorry I didn't wait until it was all proper and legal. And I'm sorry too, but I don't go out with married men. That is when I know they're married. It's finished. Over. Just leave me alone. I opened the door for him to go, and then stood back waiting. But April, you know how I feel about you. We could have a good future together, Jerry said, stalling. I gave him the coldest, hardest look I could muster. He had no choice but to give up and leave. He looked dejected, and I felt sorry for him. And for a second, I almost said, "It's okay. We could still be friends at least." I didn't. I closed the door on my almost first lover. For the next few months, I didn't go out on any dates. I just stayed in and I moped. When Cheryl brought home another one of her strays for supper, I didn't even mind. That's what I called the Métis and Indian girl she befriended from the Friendship Center. Nancy was a dark-skinned native girl with long, limp, black hair. The story of her family's life was similar to that of other native girls that Cheryl met. Drinking always seemed to be behind it. Nancy had been raped by her drunken father. Cheryl remarked that people call that incest, but Nancy insisted it was rape. Everyone in Nancy's family drank, even the younger kids, or the new rage was sniffing glue. Both Nancy and her mother had prostituted themselves, sometimes for money, sometimes for a cheap bottle of wine. Nancy was like a wilted flower. She even had a defeatist look to her. What a life to have led. I suppose she stayed at home because there was nowhere else to go. I was shocked when Cheryl told me that Nancy was only 17. She looked at least 25. How Cheryl could stand there to hear all those kinds of stories all the time was beyond me. That she wanted to make a lifetime career out of the impossible for me was what was impossible for me to understand. How Cheryl could stand to hear those kinds of stories all the time was beyond me. That she wanted to make a lifetime career out of it was impossible for me to understand. It was depressing, especially when I knew that Nancy and the other strays came from the same place that we'd came from. I'd go out with Cheryl and Nancy to nice restaurants and treat them to suppers. I began to notice what being native was like in the middle class surroundings. Sometimes service was deliberately slow. Sometimes I'd overhear comments like, "Who let the Indians off the reservation?" Or you'd be walking home and guys would make comments to us as if we were easy pickups. None of us would say anything, not even Cheryl, who always had been sharp-tongued. Cheryl and I never talked about these things either. Instead of feeling angry at these mouthy people, I just felt embarrassed to be seen with natives, Cheryl included. I gradually began to go out with them less and less. Anyhow, Cheryl was starting to spend more evenings at the Friendship Center, leaving me alone with my magazines and my daydreams. I was even reading books on proper etiquette, preparing myself for the promising future in white society. If Cheryl had known I was reading that kind of material, she would have laughed or criticized me. It wouldn't have mattered because I began to think I would be dreaming such dreams right into my senility. Oh well, Cheryl once had a fantasy which comforted her, and now I had mine. The other thing I thought a great deal about was the kind of man I would marry. If my future were to be successful and happy, I would have to give the man of my life much consideration. I would not be able to afford to let my heart rule my head. I couldn't marry for money, or I'd be rich, but I wouldn't be happy. So I had to find someone who was handsome, witty, and charming. He'd have to be a good, honest person with a strong character, but he'd also have to have a fine sense of humor. He'd be perfection and personified. Oh yeah, dream on, April Raintree. If such a man existed, he'd be surrounded by females. What makes you think you could ever compete? With all my planning and everything, I'd probably end up falling in love with a poor farmer or something, and I'd have to work for the rest of my life. But that spring, my Prince Charming did come into my life. I was typing a mortgage agreement when he walked into the office. He was to see Mr. Lord, and the receptionist sent him to my desk. I let him stand there without even looking up at him, and when I finished typing, then I looked up into his merry blue eyes. He was one of the smoothest, handsome men. The kind I didn't like, the kind that was polished. He just had to be conceited. He smiled at me as he asked to see Mr. Lord. I told him Mr. Lord had a dentist appointment that morning and had been delayed. I asked him to return at 1 o'clock. Well, I suppose I could be induced, but to return by you having lunch with me. I thought of saying something. I'm sorry I'm busy, because it was obvious he was a conceited type. I had thought that he was. Instead, I asked, how do you know I'm not married? I looked for a wedding ring. There's none. He spread his fingers before me to show that he was not wearing a ring either. I looked closely at his finger and saw that there were no telltale marks. At the same time, I figured he couldn't be so conceited after all. Since he didn't wear any flashy rings, I realized some of the other secretaries had stopped to watch. I smiled self-consciously and said, well, I don't take lunch till 12. I'll wait. I'll wait. For the next half an hour, I felt him watching me from where he sat. My fingers felt too stiff to do any typing at all, but I made a show of being efficient by finishing page after page, all filled with mistakes. Over lunch, he introduced himself as Bob Radcliffe from Toronto. He had his own wholesale furniture business, which he ran with his mother. His father had died when he was in university, and he and his mother had taken over the business. He was in Winnipeg to purchase land for expansion. Since I knew his home was in Toronto, I had no intentions of becoming further involved with him. Just this lunch, and that would be it. But then on our way back, he asked me out again that evening. Okay, so you must be lonely. But after this one night, that would be it. It wasn't. For the next month, we spent nearly every evening together. He met Cheryl, and he had no negative reaction. They got along quite well, considering Cheryl had resumed her anti-white role. I found Bob was gentle, good-natured, and very considerate. He was everything that I thought a good husband should be. It was just too bad he had to go back to Toronto. The events of the next several weeks are a blur in my memory. Bob proposed. He asked me, April Raintree, to be his wife. He wanted to get married in a small civil ceremony in Winnipeg. My dreams were coming true and I was ecstatically floating on cloud nine. Everything happened so quickly. The only discord came when I told Cheryl that Bob had proposed to me. I expected her to be excited and happy as I was. What do you want to go and marry this dude for? You're asking for trouble. You don't know anything about him, really. I know all I need to know. You're just saying this because of Garth, aren't you? Maybe I am. Even if Bob isn't prejudiced, maybe his friends are. And what will they think when they find out he's married a half-breed? If he had to choose, do you believe he'd stick with you? Cheryl, I said in warning, angry tone. Or what if you had children and they look like Indians? Do you want them to go what we went through? It would be better for you to stick to your own kind. I've always felt so out of place living with a white family surrounded by whites. You really want that for your children? Oh, of course. You're going to pass yourself off as white, aren't you? You're not going to tell anyone there who and what you are you? Well, I'm certainly not going to go around saying, hi, I'm Cheryl Radcliffe, and I'm a half-breed. So just knock it off, Cheryl. I stormed into the bathroom, cutting our discussion short. I was angry, not so much by Cheryl's telling me I shouldn't marry Bob, but by her throwing shame and guilt, or whatever it was, into my face. We'd never talked about it before. I was sure she had not suspected how I felt, but all this time, she knew. She knew I was ashamed of being a half-breed. We were married on July 25th of 1969, on a Friday afternoon with only Cheryl and a not anyone special male friend of Bob's to witness our exchange of vows. I wondered why he hadn't even wanted to invite his mother, but he had just said that's the way he wanted it. I accepted it. I was so happy. And from that moment, I wouldn't have to worry about changing the spelling of my name, because now it was legally April Radcliffe. Cheryl came with us to the airport on a Saturday afternoon when we were to fly to Toronto. I guess Bob knew that I wanted some time alone with her because he left to do some last-minute things. At first, Cheryl and I had let some of our precious minutes slip by, just looking at each other and not saying anything. Cheryl spoke first. April, in spite of what I said the other day, I do hope you'll be happy. I really do. Was just mouthing off, I'm sorry. Don't be, Cheryl. I guess I got on the defensive because some of the things you said were true, and I've never wanted to admit it. You didn't come right out and say it, but I am ashamed. I can't accept being Métis. That's the hardest thing I've ever said to you, Cheryl, and I'm glad you don't feel the same way I do. I'm so proud of what you're trying to do, but to me, being Métis means I'm one of the have-nots, and I want so much. I'm selfish, I know it, but that's the way that I am. I want what white society can give me. Oh, Cheryl, I really believe that's the only way for me to find happiness. I'm different from you. I wish I wasn't, but I am. I'm me. You have to do what you believe is right for you, and I have to go my way. Remember, though, I'll always be there if you need me. Cheryl was smiling, but sadly. Finally, she said, April, I have known how you felt for a long time, and I've decided that I was going to do what I could to turn the native image around so that one day you could be proud of being Métis. To lighten the mood, she added, Of course, you may be old and gray when the day comes, but it will come. I guarantee it. Bob came back, and it was time for us to board the plane, and for me to say goodbye to Cheryl. We hugged each other and said goodbye. It felt good. I felt that there was a new kind of honesty between us. I was moving into a new phase of my life with a man that I loved and who loved me, and I had just had a good, honest talk with the other most important person in my life. But once we were airborne, I was still thinking of Cheryl. I missed her so much already. For a younger sister, she was a lot wiser than me in some ways. So she had known about my shame for a long time, and she had never said anything. She had just accepted me the way that I was in silence. I wish that I could do that whole part of my life over again. She was such a giving, unselfish person. What was it like? What was it that made her like she was and made me like I was?